The goal for this setup with Deathstroke was to use the sword as our primary weapon of choice alongside using grenades, traversal attacks, and suicide strikes. I did this episode's mastery climb from 1 to 1000 while restricting myself to only using Deathstroke and using the firearms to counter enemies or for lantern constructs only. We managed to slowly and steadily complete the climb with less than 12,000 bullets fired and 300 reloads. Starting out with our firearms, I went with a tier 3 Grodd shotgun and tier 4 Scarecrow assault rifle because they looked cool. Since I didn't plan to use these items, I just chose whatever I felt looked cool to have and would satisfy the piece bonus I need. The tier 3 Grodd 1-piece bonus makes our grenade hits have a 50% chance to make the enemies harvestable. Then, tier 4 Scarecrow's 1-piece bonus makes all of our melee hits poison enemies and increases our shield up to 100%. For the melee, I went with the Orphan's Heartseeker because I thought the effect was cool since it spreads the suicide strike damage. The corrupted version will be fine too since it adds more strike damage. For the augments, I chose increases to my melee damage against harvestable and electrified enemies. You could also trade a bit of damage for additional affliction resource regeneration on melee hits, depending on your preference. I have Venom Frenzy as my chosen affliction because if I'm in the squad ultimate and the lantern infused enemies create a shield, it allows me to instantly break their lantern shield. Our grenade, I go with the usual Corrupted Heatwave's Incendiary Charge for its ability to make enemies take 500% more damage. Since it is also a bounce grenade, it can potentially hit an enemy multiple times and is theorized to each benefit from the tier 3 Grodd's 1-piece bonus. Augments here was damage across the board, and I went with damage to electrified to complement the chosen affliction on the grenade. I went with Livewire Bolt so that we can always electrify enemies at will, which helps our grenade harvest loop. For the lucky charm, I chose the Corrupted Two Faces coin for its ability to burn and punish nearby enemies upon getting either a melee, shield harvest, or suicide strike kill. In addition to this, we get an increase of 250% more damage dealt to punished enemies. Another reason we have a Two-Face Notorious item is because of the villain synergies with Scarecrow and Bane. The Dread and Mayhem synergy will activate after we get a suicide strike kill and will trigger either Dread or Mayhem. When Dread is active, you'll see this icon above an enemy's head and this timer might show up in your icon section. Dread will make enemies take 250% more damage from all sources, similar to the Corrupted Heatwave grenade. When combined together, we create a pseudo stack deck that allows us to do some crazy damage. The other synergy with Bane, True Face of Fury, allows us to have a 100% chance to generate grenade ammo whenever we harvest an enemy and increase our grenade damage by 100%. This is key in creating our harvest loop that will allow us to keep most enemies stun locked like the flash infused enemies, or keep enemies suspended in slow motion. The augments I chose were additional pickup radius, squad ultimate duration, and damage to electrified enemies. Next up, with the neck mod, we have the tier 3 Bane item to give us the villain synergy with Two-Face, as well as providing a small damage boost depending on how much health an enemy has remaining. Augments here were melee damage to grunts and brutes, and damage to electrified enemies. For my traversal mod, I mostly used the Turtle Steel Force Conduit since I have yet to get the Corrupted Steel Jacket's Brittle Bones. They both have pros and cons, but it's entirely up to you for what you prefer. The benefit with Turtle is having a villain synergy with Grodd that regenerates your shield upon critical hits while standing still. Augments here were additional damage to grunts, damage to brutes, and traversal attack damage to electrified enemies. Finally, the shield mod chosen was the Corrupted Dr. Psycho's Energy Amplifier. This is where we get our increase to damage dealt by having our shield overcharged, which is why shield harvesting will be really important to this setup. Since we get 50% damage dealt for each 10% of shield we have, we want to maximize our shield capacity as much as possible. In addition to this, if we stay overcharged, we can craze enemies whenever we land a melee hit on them. The augments I chose were additional shield overcharge and shield capacity, while pickup radius or critical hit chance would be the last options. There are also some villain synergies with Grodd and Scarecrow as well that give us another small boost. With Grodd and Psychotic Rage, we can get an additional 100% shield overcharge if we have one crazed enemy near us. With Scarecrow and Mind Games, we have a variety depending on if we afflict an enemy. Moving on to the talents that I wanted to highlight for this build, we leaned heavy into Bleed and the Death Touch talent that drops live grenades whenever we shield harvest an electrified enemy. We have Shrapnel Grenade, Perfect Edge, and 1000 Cuts to allow our grenade hits, melee hits, and traversal attacks the ability to make enemies bleed. In addition to this damage they receive, remember that some of our gear effects will make enemies take more damage from all sources. The idea is that not only will our attacks do more damage, but the talent effects would be affected too, which is why Blood Spatter becomes a very interesting option to have equipped. If we manage to land a melee kill, we will cause enemies within 10 meters to take 10% of their health as damage. The theory with enemies taking more damage from the effects of the Corrupted Heatwave and Dread abilities could mean that 10% of health that would be considered as damage could be increased to something closer to 50% of their health. This is why we went all in on melee focused talents. Anything that allowed us to apply Bleed, since we also do increased damage to enemies that are bleeding thanks to Salt in the Wound. We also have Hot Zone that allows us to stop enemies from burning and drop shield pickups whenever we land grenade hits. Then, if we kill a crazed enemy, Mass Hysteria can increase the damage of our next grenade up to 100%. And finally, given certain situations, we can also increase our Suicide Strike damage with Contained Situation and Cold Heart. I think this combination of talents allows us to utilize every piece of gear effects that we have and makes for an interesting melee-only setup if you wanted to. I found this setup to be quite fun to use the whole way up to 1000, but it was a bit of a cruising speed on most missions up to a certain point. That's when some clears would go from finishing within 3 minutes to finishing within 10 minutes. Partially due to the dependence on Bleed and Poison assisting your overall damage output, but also due to melee being the focus. There were many times, and I mean many times, I would miss an enemy and can't hit them, especially if they are in the air. It is a bit tougher to hit enemies in the air, but it has gotten a little bit easier, or I've just gotten lucky. The combination of the slow motion and squad ultimate can slightly hinder the melee focus, but it is not the end of the world. I usually just move on to another enemy that I can hit since I have poison and bleed that can do damage while I move from enemy to enemy. Combining everything from the gear to the talents with effects like bleed and poison, I felt this was an enjoyable setup that also fit a League of Assassins theme, primarily using only the sword. Here are the loadouts I had equipped for Joker, Mrs. Freeze, and Lawless for a majority of the way up, along with their talents. Not much has changed since the Lawbreakers video, with the exception of Lawless. And as always, I hope you enjoyed the video or maybe learned something new. Liking and sharing the video is greatly appreciated. Be sure to hit subscribe and keep notifications on to know when the next video will be uploaded. Thank you for watching and have a wonderful year.